I'm Alastair Campbell. I've written a novel called Maya, which is the story of A-list British film star, Maya, and is narrated by somebody she was at school with, a guy called Steve. They were best friends at school. He stayed very friendly with her. She's got married to somebody else, he's got married to somebody else, she's become very famous, he's not very famous, and it's really the story of how her fame changes not just their friendship but also all the main relationships in her and his lives. The specific impulse for this came, I think, when I was out for lunch with my daughter, and she was getting really fed up because people were staring at us and she could see that people were talking about me, and sometimes she just gets a bit angry when that happens, when we're just out sort of being kind of normal and stuff. And I just started to think about writing something about whether it's possible to be quite well known, as I was, I guess, when I was in Downing Street, and then kind of turn it off and just stop. And that was the impulse. That was the sort of thing where it started. But then I broadened out from that, and eventually it became this story of Maya and Steve, this guy that narrates it. And I don't know. I really don't know where it's come from. But there is a lot of me in there. There's a lot about the way that I guess, fame and the spotlight, if you like, interacts with the 24 media age, and how that has, if you like, put more pressure on people and puts pressure on relationships as well. But it's much more, it's not a polemic about the media, and it's not a polemic about the celebrity culture, but it is a story of how fame affects the famous and the non-famous. I was doing an interview at Sky the other day, and the producer who'd read it said, "I'd love to be able to say that the portrayal of 24-hour news is inaccurate, but I'm afraid it's absolutely spot on." When something that is deemed to be a big story happens, I mean, there's a point in the book where there's a marriage breakup that becomes very, very big and goes whoosh on the news, a bit like if Beckham and Victoria Beckham, suddenly broke up, and so you have all these people flooding into the studios and people texting their views who've never met them and don't know anything about them, and commentators coming on as though it's like the most important thing in the world. And of course, the last story they were talking about, which was the most important thing in the world at that time, that just sort of disappears. Nobody cares about that anymore. So there's a bit of that sort of, the way 24-hour news works and how that affects people who are in the public eye and how they have to deal with that. But it's much more a story of relationships. It's about, I suppose the main relationship is Maya and Steve, but also then his wife, who's a really nice person, she's one of the few really nice people in the book. Her parents, who find her fame very difficult. They can't understand why people talk about her so much and write about her and are so bitchy about her. And then there's an agent who's a very kind of pretty hard-nosed guy who's managing through all these difficult waters. And then there's private detectives, and there's a guy who moves in, and there's a lot going on. But it's and I've been really pleased with the response so far. Most of the reviews do seem to recognise it's a page turner. No doubt about that.